It is my pleasure to welcome you to the afternoon panel on dispute resolution perspectives. A few years back, when I was teaching at the University of Cincinnati, the late Justice Scalia visited the school for a talk. As it is customary in those type of occasions, the dean of the law school introduced Justice Scalia by reading excerpts from his biography, where he had gone to school, where he has worked, where he has practiced. And he went on for a little bit. When the dean finished, and when Justice Scalia came to the podium, he jokingly said or noted that speakers' introductions are inversely related to the fame and reputation of the speakers. The most famous speakers get the shorter introductions. And with no disrespect to the members of this morning panels, it occurs to me that perhaps Justice Scalia was right on this one. If the singer Bono was speaking at this program today, and I was tasked with introducing him, I probably will not read his biography. I would just say, ladies and gentlemen, here is Bono, and you will know that. The three speakers that we have this morning, this afternoon, I think have truly achieved that rock star status in the world of dispute resolution. So I know I could get by just saying, ladies and gentlemen, here are Lisa, Jennifer, and Grant, and that will be sufficient. But if with the dispensation, at least I will say their full names and the schools where they are from. Lisa Blomgren Amsler is at the University of Indiana Bloomington. Dean Jennifer Brown is at Quinnipiac School of Law, and Professor Grant Lum is at Ohio State University. So thank you much for being here. We'll now go in that order, and we will do the 20 minutes presentation followed by about half an hour of questions and answers. Thank you.
So it's Lisa Blomgren Amsler at Indiana University. And the only reason I do that is because there is a University of Indiana, only it's in Pennsylvania. On that happy note, this is a talk to try to put together on the ground how we might reorganize the way we think about these conflicts on campus, and that's why I'm calling it collaborative governance on campus. I want to talk a little bit about dispute system design, about conflict management system design. These are overlapping terms for a very similar process. And then how we might combine this with collaborative governance in the context of a campus, and by doing that, bridge dialogue, deliberation, and conflict resolution. And my inspiration is about 15 years ago, I thought we could do a conflict assessment at Indiana University. And I went to HR and I talked to the guy in charge of labor relations, because I had been a labor lawyer for 10 years before I became an academic, and I thought he would be able to give me a good sense of conflict on campus. And he laughed and laughed, and he said, Lisa, this is like doing a conflict assessment on a medieval city. There is no organizational chart. There are dotted lines. It's not clear what all the processes are. Don't even try. And I didn't. Well, we tried, but we failed. So if we think about conflict resolution on campus, there is a body of work done by other scholars and practitioners trying to help us with this conflict assessment. And Bill Waters at Wayne State University was given money by the Hewlett Foundation to put together a resource center for conflict resolution in higher education. We've also had a series of very prominent, highly regarded scholar practitioners, Howard Gadlin and Mary Rowe, who have been ombudspeople at universities, Mary Rowe at MIT, Howard first at UCLA, and then he went to NIH in DC. And there are lists and links to these programs around the country, but I have to warn you, they're out of date. I used link under Ombuds, which in theory was in the School of Business, and when I clicked it, there's nothing there. So that, I think, is a good metaphor for the state of conflict resolution system design on campus. It's work we need to do. And the system designs that we know about are about conflicts between individuals, primarily. They're not about collective voice, and the kinds of conflicts we've been talking about today are about collective voice. So how do we think about this? Well, this notion of dispute system design, human-centered system design, conflict management system design is gaining traction in the literature, and this framework is from my colleagues at Stanford Law School, Jan Martinez and Stephanie Smith, with a salute to Maud Pavir, who taught the first dispute system design at Stanford course at Stanford Law School, and now Grant is teaching there with my colleagues. They came up with some categories for analyzing the system. And goals. We've been talking about the goals today. What should be the goals of system design when we think about the kinds of conflicts we've been having on these campuses? Well, I would argue that one of the goals, in keeping with Professor Post's lecture before lunch, is we are an educational institution. We ought to be teaching people civic skills. We ought to be teaching and modeling the skills of democracy on campus. Who are the stakeholders? Where aren't the students? If this is like a medieval city, the students are residents and citizens of the city. They're also stakeholders, and ought not they have a voice in this? Context and culture. The university context, the college context is unique, and the culture of academic freedom and the traditions of the academy are unique. Structures and processes. What do we have in place? Do we know? Have we tried to map it at our own institutions? And then what resources do we have? And this is, of course, a problem in the academy right now, because we're looking at public universities struggling with budget cuts as a result of changes in priorities and also the economy and how that's affecting every state. And then finally, how do we evaluate this? And now at is it Middlebury that's using restorative practice? And they talked about evaluating how that would work, but this question of transparency and accountability in whatever system we design is an interesting one. So collaborative governance is a phrase that's in use in public affairs, and I teach in a school of public and environmental affairs. Although I am a lawyer by training, I am surrounded by sociologists, political scientists, economists, sigh, deep sigh, and others. And so collaborative governance is something that has a couple of different definitions. It's got a lot of currency right now in the literature in public affairs. We've had Jody Freeman write about it with David Markell. Tom Tyler is doing work related to it. But if my argument, and I actually made this argument in the journal here from a symposium here, and the issue came out in 2009, is that it's just a descriptive phrase that covers a wide variety of processes. But it covers those processes along the policy continuum. And if we think of it as a stream, then we've got processes upstream that we haven't really been talking about much in the field of dispute resolution. So processes that are where we're making policy upstream in the legislative or quasi-legislative arena. We've got dialogue, deliberation, those words, dialogue's familiar to conflict resolution as a field. Deliberative democracy tends to be siloed off in the political science arena. So if we think that's upstream in the legislative, quasi-legislative place, midstream in the executive branch, as Professor Post was talking about the managerial function of universities, in the executive branch, we're implementing policy. And in government, when we look at collaborative governance, there's an overlap in executive branch agencies across the policy continuum because they do quasi-legislative work, they do management, and then they do quasi-judicial work. So they have all three, deliberative democracy, ADR, and collaborative public management. And then downstream, we have that judicial and quasi-judicial work of dispute resolution and mediation and adjudication and administrative law judges that we're familiar with. Well, can we put this together on campus? And if we did, what would it look like? So here's a map, it's a very reductionist map. It makes it look linear. We all know that the policy process is not linear. We might start upstream at the legislative branch, but then we end up downstream in the Supreme Court throwing some statute out, and it goes back to the legislative branch. So it's really more like a spiral over time. But for our purposes, let's make it linear. And this just illustrates for you how the different families of voice processes, this is all about voice, how they overlap and where they fit depending on what we're doing. Well, how does that relate to a university? This was my crude attempt to map different places in the university campus where we might integrate a voice process. What my late colleague Eleanor Ostrom, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics, and a beloved economist, actually. She was a political economist. What she would call an action arena. There's something called the Indiana School of Institutional Analysis and Development, and she was the founder of that through the Ostrom Workshop and other colleagues, including her husband Vincent Ostrom in the political science department. And so each of these little lines below my map of the continuum is an action arena. You think about the University Board of Trustees. They're making policy that governs the university. What role do students have? They have one elected member, generally, at least at Indiana, of the Board of Trustees. I've put the state legislature and agency in parentheses because one important thing about Ostrom's work is to recognize that rules and laws are exogenous variables in action arenas, as we heard about the law under the First Amendment and the statute in Missouri that makes the entire campus a public forum. And so what's happening in these different lines is, of course, in the shadow of the law. So what happens in the faculty council, the legislative student body, the Greek governance system? We have many fraternities and sororities in Bloomington, although 3 have been evicted in the last 2 years of the fraternities. That's what happens when people drink too much, underage. We have the residence hall systems. And when you think of that as upstream, well, we could develop ways of incorporating student voice in these various settings, and more deliberative democratic voice. I'll give you some examples in a second. If you look midstream, there are all these familiar things, and this does begin to look like a city's organizational structure, right? We've got budget, we've got HR, we've got labor relations, the health center, facilities management. This is a place where we see ombuds offices reporting directly to the president of the university. And then downstream, we may have student mediation services on campus, as well as adjudicatory processes for violations of the honor code, promotion and tenure appeals. We may have ombuds offices in individual units. So in theory, although I haven't talked to these people, they're at the business school and they're in the biology department in Bloomington. Well, how would we do collaborative governance on campus? How can we incorporate students? Would this, in keeping with our primary mission and goal of teaching, how do we go about teaching or developing a better curriculum, engaging the students in the development of this curriculum, potentially, on civics, civility, and debate? Debate is the reasoned use of arguments when we have major policy disagreements. How could we maybe empower students to develop programs in their housing units? And when we do that, can we also at least have deliberative engagement? If we don't give power over decision making, we can still do deliberative engagement prior to the decisions. So if we take a look at how these various action arenas, keeping in mind our university action arenas. What are these processes that we might borrow? And this is just a map of processes across the policy continuum currently in use in various examples in both federal, state, and local government. And they include things like a citizens' assembly. The citizens' assembly in Vancouver that met in Vancouver to develop a provincial change, I believe in voting laws, had a man and woman, they wanted gender representation, from each community in the province selected at random to participate. The deliberative polling. This is a social science experiment you could do where we do a random sample of students, we pay them to go away for a weekend, we provide access to experts in a particular policy arena, and we have them surveyed before, deliberate over the weekend, and survey them again afterward about a policy decision they could make that matters on campus. They will, generally the data show, they will be closer together in their opinions after this experience than before. Choice work dialogues, study circles, public conversations are all small group dialogue processes where, again, empirical research indicates that if people who radically disagree with each other sit down at a table of maybe 8 to 10 with a good facilitator and have a discussion, they will actually end up agreeing more at the end than they agreed at the beginning. If you put people who all already agree with each other together at tables, you let them self-select, you get the opposite result. They're more rigid, which is what's happening with people selecting the sources of information on the media that they agree with, you know, the Fox News, MSNBC divide. I prefer BBC personally, but it does the same thing. It just makes people more rigid. So could we use that? Citizen juries we could use. They're in California. They're used in cities. They're not the jury you think of in court. They're a jury that keeps track of what the city council is doing by they're selected at random, and they do a study on whether a policy or its implementation is working, and they then advise the legislative branch. Consensus conferences are much larger scale things like that we could actually have to advise the Board of Trustees. Horror, they would say. So let's go midstream. We've got this big budget. What voice do students have in the budget? What voice do they have in at least the discretionary parts of it? Participatory budgeting would actually allow them to gather and propose projects and vote on them and select them through voting. For some small portion of the budget, it's used for discretionary funding in Chicago in certain of the aldermen's districts. Negotiated rulemaking, we could maybe use that. Now we're getting into the familiar world of conflict resolution, mediation, arbitration, fact-finding. What about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for sexual violence on campus? Well, how would that play out? It wouldn't necessarily, well, maybe it would. Professor Post, tell me, are we in any region where we're violating the First Amendment? People don't have to come, just like they don't have to come to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Okay, so since I have relatively few minutes left, this was not what I was originally I wasn't originally gonna give this talk. I was originally going to give a talk about the fact that the average reading level in the United States is 8th grade. The fact that only about 1/3 of our population has a college degree. The fact that over the last 20 years, the student loan situation has changed radically and is now at crisis proportions. The fact that the funding needs of universities are such that entities trying to influence the curriculum and also who's hired on campus are dangling big amounts of money on the condition that they get to pick the faculty member or the students who get the fellowships. And there's a great book about dark money, so I need not name anyone. So, given that, isn't it our obligation to pick up where the K through 12 educational system left off in terms of teaching civic skills? The civics curriculum has fallen by the wayside in the light of mass standardized testing and repeated standardized testing. And so at Johns Hopkins University, they have a curriculum for civic skills that Dr. Forney is teaching and writing about. He wrote a book where he put together sources from religious texts, from all over, from books on manners, from Miss Manners, on civility, and these 25 rules that encompass many of everything I could think of. Then we have also research projects nationwide at the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at Tufts University, which is part of the Tisch College of Civic Life. And in these research projects, they're collecting data from a number of participating universities on how college affects student voting patterns, how much political efficacy they have when they get out. And I've got a colleague, I was the chair of the search committee that hired him. Yes. His name is Matt Begetta. He was a student at Harvard in sociology, and Robert Putnam was on his committee, and he's doing a longitudinal study of how student participation in groups on campus, all the different extracurricular activities we have, depending on how that extracurricular activity is organized and how democratic the structure of it is, what is their political efficacy coming out in long term? So people are looking at this. So let me go back. So you see that little picture on the side? The reason I didn't give the talk I was going to give is I was having brunch at a cafe in Bloomington, and to my right on the bookshelf, it's one of those wonderful places where you can have lattes and books. There was this, one of these books they have in the gift shop in Washington, D.C., on the life of George Washington. I didn't know he had a copybook on the rules of civility and decent behavior. And I started reading it, and it was fascinating. And these are just a few of them. But what I noticed was, wow, these tend to overlap with what we teach in our negotiation courses in terms of active listening and integrative bargaining skills, interest-based bargaining skills. There's some overlap here. Let your countenance be pleasant, but in serious matters, somewhat grave, right? We're talking about body language there. Use no reproachful language against anyone, neither curse nor revile. Wow. So there are more of them. I can't read them all to you, but they're there for you. So in conclusion, if we're like a city, then could we use collaborative governance as a way of beginning to manage our city? Could we incorporate students in the governance structure somehow? And could we build civic skills and capacity in the process of giving them that opportunity to exercise dialogue and deliberation in these different fields?
Well, I very much want to thank the organizers of this symposium for inviting me here, because I have already learned so much today. I've learned a lot about the First Amendment, which I didn't know, and I've also learned a lot from hearing about the experience of those who've grappled with the issues on the ground, and so thank you very much for sharing those. I wanted to sort of take a note out of Oprah Winfrey's playbook, because she writes an essay at the end of her magazine each time, What I Know for Sure. And so I thought to try to focus on what I know for sure about dispute resolution and speech on campus. And here's what I came up with. I don't think I know much for sure about these topics. I want to be very transparent about that. What I do want to talk about is what I believe to be important most of the time. And if this framework is helpful for sort of coming up a little bit from the details on the ground, then that is terrific. First of all, and I think we heard it this morning, context matters. Context is absolutely key. And when we are resolving disputes that arise from free speech on campus, we very much have to take this case-by-case approach to look at the context and to look at the facts in the individual case. Second, we need to look to whether there is an ongoing relationship between the parties in this dispute, in this speech situation. We in dispute resolution talk about this all the time, and it seems particularly true in these contexts. And if there is the absence of an ongoing relationship between the speaker and the audience, or between those who have invited the speaker and those who will be impacted by the speaker's words, that's something we really have to take into account, because it's going to have a huge impact on both the incentives to come to the table and also our options for crafting deals, if you'll pardon that vocabulary, in this context. The third thing I think we need to bear in mind is that compromise and common ground can be quite complicated in many of the situations that we are talking about. Compromise is often a dirty word in the situations that come for resolution and development. Looking too hard for common ground can distract from the core disagreement in ways that can be really quite destructive. And that's particularly true, I think, for historically underrepresented or oppressed people, that they not be distracted from the wrong that may be occurring in the speech because they're being urged to look for common ground with the speaker. And then finally, I think we need to think about community quite a bit and how we define it, if there is one. Even if, and I think in some of these situations, and I'd like to explore this a little bit toward the end of my remarks, maybe there's a community, but it's quite ephemeral. It sort of comes into being for this time when we're contending with what is going to be said and how we'll deal with the impact of that. And we might call it a sort of a community of contention, because the people who will hear it and the people who will speak these words have to be in that moment a part of a community. I'll say more about that in a minute. So, context. Nearly 40 years ago, I think, Frank Sander introduced the idea of the multi-door courthouse. And since then, dispute resolution theory and practice has focused on fitting the forum to the fuss. And just as we recognize that dispute resolution practices operate differently in these different factual contexts, I suspect that the way dispute resolution might approach free speech conflict on college campuses will turn in part on how we are conceiving of this dispute. And that is very important then, that we not impose a container on a dispute that doesn't fit it. Surely, as Robert Post said, and I think others have remarked, universities are, in a sense, in loco parentis with respect to their students. I think Robert Jerry's point this morning about, sort of what might be said in the city is different from what might be said in the home, and having some sensitivity to the extent to which the speech is occurring in something that's much more a family-like context than a civic context. Since I've become dean, I'm particularly aware of this next one. Our students are, in many ways, our customers. Their parents are our customers. And more, education is sort of packaged as a product. It's an experience, but it is a product. And people who have paid for an experience and a product can hold the school, I think, accountable for the quality of what they receive. And so in some of these cases, the disputes that we're going to be dealing with are perhaps more like a business context, and we need to be aware of that. We've talked a lot about community or public settings, and I think this idea of what happens when strangers are in a dispute is worth thinking about. Because, you know, if you have a car accident with someone you've never met, and you expect never to deal with them again, you wouldn't expect the dispute resolution process you use to resolve that case to be the same as what might be used for someone who's your neighbor or a family member or a future business partner. And when strangers come together for these contentious speech situations, we need to be aware that that is part of the context. And some of the people, as I'm sure has been true for the folks who spoke this morning, the people are difficult to identify. The folks with the black masks who showed up at Middlebury could not really be identified ahead of time, I suspect. And so what was possible in a dispute resolution process there is quite different. And then finally, of course, we know that sometimes people are enemies, and that has to be taken into account. Okay, so I'm in a very quick slide, I'm sort of echoing, I think, what Lisa has talked about in dispute resolution design. I mean, a cottage industry has grown up in dispute resolution theory and practice, trying to describe what are the elements of a conflict, and then how can we match the needs of that conflict to some of the different methods that are here. And of course, Lisa's presentation went far beyond these traditional dispute resolution techniques, but here we have a bunch of them. And I won't say much more about that, except to think that these conflicts that arise on college campuses may be like many of the others that we deal with in dispute resolution. We're looking at the essential elements and trying to figure out how to match it to the technique or the dispute resolution technique that we have in hand. Now, I could add to this slide, I guess, really, again, back to Middlebury, the inspired idea to begin training in restorative practice, because that's actually a capacity building technique that then sort of builds up the resources on campus to be deployed later when disputes arise. Mediation is a huge category, and I wanted to pause on it for a moment. For those in the audience maybe who haven't had as much exposure to dispute resolution or mediation practice, and to really, you know, think about how much the styles, the orientations, and the tactics of mediators can vary depending on how they've been trained and the work that they've done. I think a great example of that could have potential payoff in the free speech cases, and it's worth thinking about if mediation were to be used, is to think about the work that's been done around mediation in environmental cases or land use cases. And I mean, people like Lawrence Susskind, Josh Stolberg, Ellen Waldman have written very helpfully, I think, about mediator ethics in these kinds of cases, where that dispute is going to have externalities, huge spillover effects for people who can't be at the table. They can't be identified, they're future generations, they're off in distant places. And the mediator may take on a really different role then, perhaps actually advocating for norms in ways that mediators wouldn't outside of that setting. So context matters. Other processes may dominate, especially when we lack a shared community. And I think we should also note that, and it sounds like in the morning we heard some of these situations where for some speakers, given their history, their aims, their relationships with the institution, no process is the one that they would choose. They would exit process or engage in civil disobedience, specifically to make the important point they need to make. Now, so my take-home number one here is that we have to, or we should, examine the emotional, social, political context for the speech that is at issue to figure out sort of where it might fall on that list of the kinds of disputes that can arise and how dispute resolution might be tailored to fit it. And here's where I want to make a cautionary point, because sometimes in the sort of after-the-fact analysis, cell phone cameras and social media can mislead us possibly about the nature of the conflict or the nature of the speech event that we are witnessing. I'm thinking specifically about what happened at Yale University with the undergraduate who was caught on a video recording yelling at Nicholas Christakis. And as you view that video, right, it looks like the public square, right? They're all standing outdoors in what looks like a college courtyard having a discussion / debate or something like that. But because I live near New Haven and I've had lots of conversations with students at Yale, my understanding of that exchange has really evolved. And what I want to at least ask is, what if instead of being a public dispute, a public square interaction, that is instead actually a family dispute, right? Where Nicholas Christakis' fatal error was in failing to see that sort of fulsome civil discourse is only possible, it's actually enabled when people feel safe in their homes and they feel supported in their homes. Then they go out into the public square for this discussion. And he thought he was a professor who was introducing them to potentially offensive ideas, right, as one might do in the classroom. But they understood him in a different role. They understood him actually to be a parent as the head of Silliman College, and he betrayed them, and he made their home unsafe. And then, infuriatingly, would not hold himself accountable for that betrayal. I throw that out there. I tell that because I think if you go back sometime and look at the video again, you might see that interaction a little differently, and you might despair less about a breakdown in civil discourse on college campuses, and think a little more carefully about the relationship between that particular administrator and the students who were in his care. Let me use that phrase again, in his care. Okay, so the centrality of ongoing relationships is another thing that I think those of us in dispute resolution talk about a lot. I've mentioned that if there is going to be an ongoing relationship, it certainly creates incentives to cooperate that would be absent in the case of, the car accident, right? It also gives rise to the possibility for some value creation through forward-looking deal-making. And that can contrast with the sort of backward-looking dispute resolution. So again, even if we're looking at a speech event after the fact, and harm has been done, the options for the parties to talk about that and to work through maybe the pain, the harm that's occurred, could be very different if they know they will have an ongoing relationship. And I think the thing that's tricky about this is that trying to define the ongoing relationship and define the community can be really challenging. If you go too far up the scale and you just say, well, we're all Americans, that's our community, that's our relationship, let's work on that. It's far too far too diluted. We all live on frat row, maybe starts to get a little closer, or I'll see you Monday in chemistry class, then it's getting even closer. Or no one is anonymous on a campus of 1,000 students, or perhaps even 2,500. And I just want to pause for a moment and say how my own thinking about this has changed a little bit. One of the early pieces I wrote was a pretty pessimistic and pretty negative look at the use of mediation in criminal cases, where cases are diverted from the criminal system and the offender is permitted to mediate with the victim. And that was really before we talked more about victim-offender dialogue. Back when I wrote my piece, it was victim-offender mediation, with the idea that the criminal case would be resolved outside the court system. You know, worthy goals. But I was quite concerned about the compromise of interests that occurred. You know, the victim's interests were harmed potentially, the offender's interests were harmed, and the state's interests could be compromised as well. And then I visited at Georgetown Law School and had an LLM student from Swaziland who was in my class. And I was giving my usual talk, you know, about what a problem this kind of mediation is. And she said, well, you know, that's interesting, Professor, but I've actually just come from Swaziland, where I've been designing dispute resolution processes for what we do when we bring a perpetrator of sexual assault back into his village or his very, very small community to have to live with the person that he assaulted. And as I listened to her speak more about that, it really did sort of change my view. I'm not saying that we should be adopting those processes on college campuses or in the United States, but when people must live in community, and that's a big question, must they live in community together? But if we decide that they will, we definitely have different kinds of incentives to continue to work together and talk. So looking for these ongoing relationships is sometimes what will bring people to the table and sometimes allow them to leave the table with a livable agreement. Now, let me say a little bit about compromise and common ground. I do think that when a speaker threatens community members' identity or their legitimacy, again, my question to Professor Post, I think I agreed with the answer. People must deal with these difficult ideas. But we have to ask, if we're going to try to apply dispute resolution to these kinds of disputes, what is it possible to concede? Is there a deal to be made? And sometimes common ground distracts us from the underlying injustice that is the subject of discussion. And I want to thank you, Owen Fiss, for reminding us of that. And I'm about out of time, so I want to just throw out another sort of video thing that some of you may have seen, and it was part of what got me thinking about this. There was a video that went viral in September that featured a guy named Hawk Newsome, who was from the Black Lives Matter of Greater New York, who was invited onto the stage at a sort of a pro-Trump rally. I think it was called the Mother of All Rallies, right? How many of you saw this video? Anybody? It's on you can find it. I think it was Now This, which puts up a lot of stuff on Facebook, had it. And, you know, he got up on stage, and to his credit, with, you know, no preparation really, was able to find things to say that generated applause from that audience. Things like, I'm an American, and the great thing about this country is when you see something that's broke, you can mobilize to fix it. Or, we're not anti-cop, we're anti-bad cop. "Ooh, yay," right? And then afterwards, he was shaking people's hands, and his picture was taken, and it was a sense of, wow, there's some real common ground here. This is possible. But he has also been subject to trenchant criticism for having squandered an opportunity, for having been distracted by this effort to find common ground, when instead maybe something more confrontational should have been happening. So I want to just suggest that in these settings, I think we need to adopt a sort of cautious approach in thinking about negotiating, problem solving, when it comes to free speech battles, because what is at stake for people may be much too great and much too deep to lend itself to this. And I know I'm out of time, but the last thing I want to say on this, because I don't want to end on such a pessimistic note, and I'm like Miss Popular Culture here today, so I'm going to tell you one other popular culture point that has really given me a lot to think about. There's a podcast now that's called Conversations with People Who Hate Me. And there's a guy named Dylan Marin, who's an artist, and he puts up videos that have a sort of political valence. And he gets a lot of negative emails, a lot of negative comments. And he records himself on the telephone talking to the people who've written some of the most vitriolic comments. I think it is inspired that he has found a way to take the technology that gives rise to anonymity and negativity, and on almost a kind of wholesale level is showing us some of the kind of curiosity and radical empathy in these conversations that we may start to model in other contexts. So that's my final point, and thank you very much.
Okay. First of all, I do want to thank the organizers again. I mean, in each session, I've seen my own mind see a new perspective. Even from the thinking of what happened at Yale, having that family perspective, it's something that I hadn't thought of. Because I've been thinking a little bit about these issues, and even the morning of having a different framework by which to do it. First of all, I would say, I don't think Raphael's correct. We are not known by our single names. But if you're going to call me my single name, he actually got it right. It's Gran. Because of Starbucks, everybody thinks it's Grande. So I have to use a Starbucks name not to get a Grande-sized cup. But I also want to start by giving a little bit about where my perspective comes from. And part of it is because I don't think any of you may know, very few of you may know, but I actually was in the Department of Justice for 4 years, from 2012 to 2016, running an agency called the Community Relations Service. So our job was to go into situations involving race and to attempt to mediate in those situations. So it's really fascinating to hear what Jennifer had to say about it. So it was going into places like Sanford, Florida, Baltimore, Maryland, after tragedies had occurred. And what is possible there, I think, is a really big question that I'll talk a little bit about. But I do want to thank my fellow panelists, because I thought I was going to begin teaching at Stanford a course called Divided Communities, and I thought I would have 6 months to write my own cases and simulations, but they asked me to stay for an additional 6 months, so I only had like a week really to prepare for my course. So I was very lucky to use Jennifer's case, a Springfield Outfest case, which was on First Amendment issues, and Lisa's work on the community conflicts for the book for Jan and Stephanie. So I very much thank them, or else I'm not sure I would have gotten through the term easily. In that way. I also appreciate what we're doing here, because I do still feel very strongly, and I think a lot of us who are in the dispute resolution field or its related fields, what is our goal these days? What are we trying to achieve? It is easy to become despairing about the role of conflict resolution, and at the same time, what I'm reminded of is that it is important to to not just face polarization with polarization, right? We're seeing so much demonization going on here. I am really stepping into the space of, it's even more important what we all do. Maybe it's not for value creation, right? Maybe we're not value in the terms of a substantive deal, but maybe there's something about seeing behind a position, seeing behind why somebody voted a certain way or why they feel a certain way. So I'm glad for this opportunity to go further into that. And here's part of the reason why I see the glass is half full. Sometimes we are seeing on the college campuses this belief that these students they're coddled. They've been wrapped in bubble wrap with their cell phones, right? With a drone watching them that the parents run, with helicopter parents, right? So we have this vision that they have to be protected from everything. I think there's so many positives. I have a college-age daughter and a high school-age son. And they've been raised on anti-bullying, on diversity initiatives. There's a way in which where they're coming from, I think, is caring, right? It's a desire to be safe, emotionally safe. And the way they've experienced free speech may be differently from those who are older than them. They've seen the dangers of free speech from their perspective. I'll remember when my daughter was, I think, about 12 years old, I was upset with her use of Facebook, and I shut it down. She was so mortified that moment. I could not believe the look on her face because of how she felt people would perceive her. So there's a way in which I hope we see there's so many positives. And I think of civil discourse, which has been mentioned by Lisa and mentioned earlier this morning as well. There are ways in which discourse is much more civil now because of what has already been done. The way we talk about race, gender, sexual orientation, disability. I remember it very differently growing up in the 70s, even in San Francisco, of how people talk to each other in a way that I think is more attuned to the person that they are talking to versus focusing it from a dominant perspective here. So I think that's important, that there's so many positives that exist alongside some of the issues that we're facing here. It does make me think further about the need. I thought this morning in terms of the explanation of free speech, right? It's a very, as we've understood from Professor Post, it's a very complicated issue. But it strikes me that and it's a question really, right? By educating folks, by educating students, by educating staff, administrators about the limits of free speech, along with restorative practices, along with critical conversations, along with these things, maybe that's what needs to happen to keep us moving forward here. So here's to me is the opportunity when I think about dispute resolution. My experience has been very much about, it's been very pragmatic. If I think about Sanford, Florida, and it seems like forever ago, when the situation when Trayvon Martin was murdered by a pseudo neighborhood watch person, a Zimmerman, right? And the question is, well, what can be mediated in a situation like that? What I would say is there's an opportunity there. And you may not remember it, but there were approximately 55 protests. National Action Network with Al Sharpton came, Jesse Jackson came down there. It was a situation, though, where there was not a single arrest. And again, there may be a question of, is that a good thing or bad thing? I'm not making a judgment about that. There was not a single glass bottle or jar thrown in that situation. And if you talked to the mayor of Sanford, the police chief at Sanford, to community leaders, to faith leaders, they attribute that to the mindset of the folks in Sanford government It just so happened in that situation, there was a person, Andrew Thomas, who had run a community dispute resolution center in Rochester, New York, who was semi-retiring to Sanford. And he happened to be working at Sanford at that time. We actually worked, I was then at the Community Relations Service, and we worked very closely with them. And they really welcomed the protesters. They went out of their way to create their permits. They drove people to the protest sites. When there was an overfill in the city hall, they had a projector screen so other folks could view an important meeting. It was a very different approach to that. In the work that I did there and the work that I do now at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, it is clearly about dealing with First Amendment free speech issues in a very pragmatic way. It's not creating agreements about the change in technology or use of force policies. It is not that at all. But it's very much about what will keep people safe. And it's about very simple things. And in the experience that I've had there are a lot of very powerful forces that you're dealing with that are really out of your control many times. And I think it's interesting to talk about culture. You've heard about culture trumps everything else, right? Or culture will dictate behavior. And what happens is at college campuses is a function of the culture that exists there. In terms of politics, I think many of you would be very aware, like, oh, when something goes wrong, there has to be a fall person, a fall guy or a fall girl for this. The third one, walk away, I threw in the dispute resolution acronym there, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It references back a little bit to what Jennifer's talking about. They are not, often when we are in those situations, there was no desire to compromise even by the protest groups. In working with a Black Lives Matter group, I do remember working between a mayor, personally negotiating between a mayor and a representative of Black Lives Matter. Our only job was really shuttle diplomacy. The Black Lives Matter group wanted to be arrested in that situation, right? But they were refusing to talk to each other. But there were things that we could convey back and forth that actually did make a difference in terms of safety. What to do if somebody got arrested? What to do? What were the concerns about the fact that it was going to be snowing that evening? There were a number of things that you could do in those situations. Social media we've touched upon, but there is no question it has changed the entire landscape for all of us on campuses and for all of us who do dispute resolution. The power of it, the ability to control it, what it does in terms of protests, it has in the old days, folks at my agency used to read the newspaper, right, to figure out what was going on that week. The speed at which things are going on matters a lot. Outsiders, that's clear an issue. In the Middlebury situation, we certainly heard about that. It certainly was true in Ferguson, right? It was, that's always been the case. If you went back to the civil rights era, there's always been talk of that. I would say this: we certainly had experience dealing with the anarchist groups, right? There are ways that we have worked with other protest groups, not the anarchist groups, to work in ways to prevent anarchists from damaging that situation. Here's a quick example. In my agency, we used to work with protesters, law enforcement, at Republican and Democratic national conventions. If there was a fear that the anarchist group was going to be there, what you would do is you would talk to the protest groups and say, let's explain to you what the tactics of these anarchist groups are going to be. And one tactic they have, for example, is they plant themselves into a different protest group and they try to start a fight with another protest, whatever the protest group is. So if you know that, what you do is you inform all the protest groups that if that happens, everybody should move out of the center, and to be aware of that, because that way they're not disrupting your protest, right? And one common practice that we utilize, that we recommend, is to have marshals, people who work with the protest groups to ensure safety, to ensure issues that there aren't conflicts in it. Law enforcement does the same thing. They did at Cleveland at least, they would have cops on bicycles in shorts and t-shirts riding between the protest groups to keep them separate, not using the most force or the most show of force, but doing it in a way that you could physically separate them and maintain safety. And they tried to do it in as friendly a way as they could. But again, this is very much a very pragmatic, in real time sort of approach that we would take. This goes a little bit more to planning, the type of work that I'm doing at Divided Community Project right now. And some of these are questions. And again, a lot more of the work that we do at the Divided Community Project is around communities, cities. But as Lisa's already said, you can certainly make the comparison there. I absolutely see the benefit, and it's been interesting hearing about what is free speech, what are the benefits, what are the limitations of it. It was great to hear both at Auburn and at Middlebury and here at University of Missouri, whatever work you're doing around critical conversations, around dialogue, around different issues. And that to me is interesting, right? At the University of California system, they have invested quite a bit in orientation programs for students, from first-year students. My daughter got a free UC Irvine sweatshirt because I think part of the idea is they want them to donate more money after they graduate. That's my thing there. But they're trying to build a sense of community too, right? I don't know how much colleges do there, but should there be some training? We talk about the need for civics training. Are we using that opportunity for how to have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you? Right? I mean, would there be a benefit to doing something like that? In the work that I did at the Community Relations Service, we certainly advocated pushed for First Amendment training for police officers who are going out there, right? We would say, have you done this? Do you know what's been going there? And in terms of, and I'll talk a little bit more about work we do bringing communities together, right? Somewhat like the idea of a city there as well. The last piece is relationship and trust building. Yeah, absent everything else, right? What we are trying to do is at the very least keep it as civil as possible, right? Those of us who've been in dispute resolution, what gets us hooked into it, and what hooked me was that I was able to enter some of the most difficult situations, and somehow by using these mediation approaches, I could deal with stuff that I would never have imagined dealing with before, right? Issues dealing with race, issues dealing with gender, that somehow by being a third party, what I think for those, when you've gone through a 40-hour mediation training, you learn that behind anger often is fear. Right? And when you're sitting there as a third party, you see a lot of anger, right? But if you can model something for them, you're creating a safety for them. And that to me has always been the benefit, that people feel safer, emotionally safer. And I'm not talking about the physical safety that I talked about earlier. I'm talking about the emotional safety that we do. We haven't talked a lot about what trigger warnings and microaggressions and a safe space. A lot of it is, I think, related to the work of dispute resolution. I do think there's some difference once you make it mandatory, right? When you say you have to give a trigger warning or you have to create a safe space versus as a facilitator or as a mediator saying, what are the ground rules that we will agree to? Or what, and then volunteering to do it. And I wouldn't, it's amazing when in the work that we've done, it's often saying, oh, it's not such a big deal, but it is. I would emphasize the benefit of that. In terms of the roles that we play, it's not just as a mediator. Bill Urey has written a very good book about the third way, or getting to peace, which says there are many roles that a third party can play. Convener, facilitator, healer, teacher, provider, And I think that's a useful frame for this as well, because as administrators, you're playing sometimes akin to a third role, sometimes. There are times when clearly you're a decision maker and all that. But I think there's a benefit to thinking about different roles here. Others have thought about this as well. James Lowy, who was considered one of the CRS's greatest mediators, later became a conflict resolution professor at George Mason University, started the first PhD program there. He talked about the mediator within community conflicts as one role in how social justice happens. That you have your media, you have your advocates, and you have a mediator. And when I've talked to a number, and I've talked to a number of social justice advocates, they appreciate someone who's there to help the process along the way. So I think there's a benefit to that. We've talked about all the training. I would certainly say, I mean, you talked about the benefit of a session like this when we hear from Auburn and Middlebury and our universities is that you're getting consulting, right? You're learning from others as to what they've done. There is a benefit to having even a convener. You've talked about, it was interesting sitting down with some of the folks from the University of Missouri about the task force that was created, and Eva earlier talking about the benefit of, and the challenge of being inclusive in this. I also want to say that it's a lens for decision makers, right? That whether or not you're a dispute resolution person, that there's a benefit. We've seen how a number of dispute resolution folks have become deans of law schools, for example, because of their problem-solving ability as well. There are, by the way, I don't think there's any question to me as we've gone through this day of the different approaches that people take. Whether you bring in Cornell West and Professor George, those are we modeling it? Are we showing it to folks? Right? Are we using it? The active listening. Who would ever question that before I disagreed, I should share my understanding of what the other person says? The hard part to do, of course, is when you're angry. Right? My wife is a marriage family therapist. I'm a mediator. Do we always have good conversations? We're both pretty tired at the end of the day, so we can argue with the best of them, right? But there's no question. There's so many things. Sustained dialogue was invented by Harold Saunders, which has been used in many colleges throughout the country. It's by bringing people who disagree on whatever difficult issues and having a continued conversation. I was at the police chiefs conference earlier this week in Philadelphia. They're doing something called Inside Out. Started at Villanova, where you bring together folks who are incarcerated and police officers, and they're co-educating each other. The research is pretty good that these sort of things can help people see a new perspective. So there's no question that it works. The hard part is implementation. The hard part, and I think Jennifer did a really great job of saying why it's so difficult here. I'm not going to go through these at great depth. If you go to our Divided Community Project website, our focus has been on communities. What should communities do in preparation for situations? Taking some of the lessons, for example, from Sanford that we had in doing so. We also had one on social media as well, because social media is such a big piece of this here. So that's the first report that we created. The second report on strategies that have been used in other communities, very much like this in terms of lessons learned. And you can either download the report or you can see the web-based version of it. But it sounds like some of the things we heard earlier today, right? It certainly builds on some of the ideas from dispute systems design as well. But our case is, how do you bring in interveners if you need it? We think there's a benefit to having that a third party. How do you identify and engage stakeholders? That's a huge question, right? Whether it's an environmental dispute or whatever it might be. Developing trust, agreeing on the protocols between the parties, and whether or not you can mediate anything, to me, being able to just help the communication, right? Preventing miscommunication. There are so many gaps when people are angry with each other. We're not at our best, right? So how do you do that in that regard? So these were lessons learned that we pulled when we brought together a number of experts in terms of those issues. Maintaining interaction, and it was useful to hear how many collaborative processes you all are using already, and the importance of interacting with the customer or the public as it were. The survey was interesting, right? The climate survey. We've created a community stress test so to see where you're at as a community, more as a dialogue tool, but certainly in thinking through finding out before something happens, right? If you're aware, are you aware of what's going on in your campus, right? Do you know, are you trying to, I have seen such a difference in communities where the mayor, the police chief are much more connected with their communities, with the minority communities in terms of their ability to then deal with whatever may happen. I just want to go to the last report, because I think that's interesting on social media. Here are the 5 that came out on, which I think really do apply for any campus here. Because there's so many rumors that fly around in these situations, right? And I was just with folks, social media coordinators from Orlando, who handled the Pulse tragedy, and how important social media, the response of those there. How do you get online information quickly? What Orlando did in that situation was, they basically said the police's social media coordinator would be the only group releasing information. They turned off they either put a voicemail on their phone saying check the Twitter account, or they sent emails saying check the Twitter account. The other departments within Orlando said go to the police department. It was important to get the information quickly out there. In terms of using social media on campuses, you're playing catch up, right? Sometimes in these, as campus administrators, is how do you get the input of folks on campus? How do you promote dialogue, real dialogue, sort of on campus? I think that's a real learning point that got reaffirmed for me today, right? Are we having the town halls? Are we having the opportunity for people to speak with each other individually? And you do have to combat hate and discrimination. In whatever ways you can in terms of what you're doing it. And this last one, acknowledging the privacy issues and all that. A lot of universities, you have your own social media that you can look at, right? You don't have to deal with privacy issues, but understanding your customers in that regard. I think I will stop there. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, panel, and thank you to the audience. I think we have a few minutes for questions. We have a microphone here, so Professor Johnson.
Thank you, the panel. So like earlier this afternoon, I'll ask a journalism-related question. One of the interesting wrinkles about what happened here at the University of Missouri 2 years ago was the conflict between journalists, whether student journalists or employed journalists, and protesters. And I think this is a conflict that we're seeing more and more, not only on college campuses, but just the other day we had a panel at the J School of journalists from St. Louis who said they've clashed with protesters there who've refused them access to public places, a lot of which comes out of a sense of distrust of communities, particularly communities of color, with journalists. And so on either side, you have protesting communities, particularly of marginalized, historically marginalized groups, who have historic grievances against the press due to negative or biased coverage of those communities. And then you have journalists who are very much operate under a hair trigger that any infringement on their right to gather the news is a horrible offense. So what kind of strategies could you suggest on college campuses for dealing, or have you dealt with issues of bringing the press in as a stakeholder and addressing their grievances with, some of these major issues?
what is interesting, there is a huge mistrust by, say, law enforcement of media, and protest groups of media. What's true is that they feel like they can go directly to their audience. They're so focused on creating their own press conferences. I don't need reporters. I'm just going to go on Facebook Live or Periscope or something like that. So I think there's a real challenge because everyone's about getting their own narrative at this point out there and unfiltered versus having the local news, the TV channels doing this. So I do think there needs to be more sort of conversation between journalists and the groups that are involved in these sort of disputes. But it is also then a trust factor too, right? You then, I would say, folks seek out the journalists that they know will tell the story from their angle. So I don't know there's an easy answer to that, but those certainly are the dynamics that we're working under in these situations now.
Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize to Professor Haley. I started using my maiden name and I made my friends' lives a misery because everyone used to know me as Lisa Bingham, and I'm going to stop using my maiden name. It's ridiculous. But I also wanted, before I answer your question directly, to say something about Indiana and Missouri. Leonard Rifkin, who founded a lot of the wonderful work done at this leading institution for conflict resolution in the country, wrote a law review article in 1998 where he held up the best curriculum in dispute resolution and the worst. And the best was here, and the worst was at Indiana University. Just letting you know. So going back to your point, there is a problem between journalism and the conflict resolution community. And it plays out in the public engagement arena. So my talk was partly about bringing that to campus. The problem is that the Freedom of Information and Sunshine laws that the journalism community worked hard to get have been enforced in a way that prevent elected officials and leaders from having the kinds of dispute resolution discussions or even discussing anything that's not on an agenda with members of the public who come to really engage with a difficult public process or problem. So I do think that the journalist community needs to take some responsibility here for that role that it's played in local governance. And there was a working group of the National League of Cities, the League of Women Voters, the International City County Management Association, somebody representing journalists, the American Bar Association, dispute resolution section, trying to come up with an amendment to the Sunshine Law that would allow more deliberative, meaningful conversations to happen between leaders and the broader public. So what you may be encountering may have a longer history and a broader, deeper history. And we need journalism, especially in this moment. And I fear for it.
If you can go to the microphone.
Just a follow-up, just made me think, what about campus journalism? I'm just curious, thinking about some of what we talked about today around speech issues, campus journalism. I'm curious any more thought you might have on that topic, just the best use of campus journalism in these issues.
I certainly think there's an advantage that campus journalists have because of their sources, right, and because of the audience that they have. I was thinking about how there's so many journalists now, right? It's so much easier to be, and so I think they do play an important role in in terms of getting an accurate story out there in these sort of protests?
I have one then for the panel. I think one of the insights, the very interesting presentation by Dean Post, was this idea that there is an alternative way of framing the First Amendment, no, at least on campus, that there is this alternative lens, alternative framework. Does that provide us as dispute resolution scholars a little bit more space than the traditional approach, no, than the sort of the Jeff Sessions model? If we are operating, that model is, if the alternative model is the place to be, what room does that allow? What can we do with that room, that space that now we have to perhaps engage the community better? Any thoughts from the panel on that?
I really appreciated Robert's address, and it seemed to me that if we're focused
There's no
on
audio.
that
I'm not sure if the
educational
mic is
mission,
on or not.
and
Oh, there she is.
if the educational mission gives us, more opportunity to regulate, it becomes even more important that we're clear about what that is. And but that, again, not to hammer the point too much, but I am so sensitive to the extent to which the kind of disputes we heard about this morning involve people
I'm not
outside
sure
our
it's on.
community,
Just trying to get
over whom
sound from
there's
other
very
mics.
little control to sort of say,
Yeah,
you are
it's
subject
so I'm
to
not sure.
our need to educate you, and therefore we can kind of cabin this conversation in a way that's consistent with the educational mission. So I think we really have to contend with that, even within that model. As a practical matter, again, with Grant's, pragmatic approach, I think it has to be factored in.
Yes, so 2 points. One is that it can be expensive too. We've seen how much Florida, Berkeley have been spending. But clearly, right, we think of a prevention plan, you're trying to do your very, very best to keep the outsiders away, and that will reduce the problems that you then you get into. What I was fascinated by, again, I was just amazed at this thinking that Professor Post provided us, and what it strikes me in trying to be pragmatic about it is, I think it gets out of, what a mediator can do well is it's less about you versus me. It's about sort of putting this third thing that makes us all accountable together. You can call it common ground or shared interest, but it's a different interest of, and it was said this morning about can we put the vision of the university forward here? Can we put academic freedom here and have it inform the way we make decisions? I don't think politically it's easy to do today, and even talking to some of the general counsel from University of Missouri, but it's a conversation that I don't think administrators are having enough of, and that you can put, it can help in creating a framework of thinking that will allow, I think, universities, campuses as a whole to deal differently than they are today.
I wonder, I went through a process that I was on the steering committee for in Bloomington and in the last year, and there was conflict at the boundaries of campus, particularly between panhandlers, folks who were homeless and living in the park adjacent to campus, students who were getting drunk in a bar near campus on property that's actually owned by IU through the foundation. And we did it was one of the larger public engagement processes we had. And I would just caution us with this word outsiders, because, I mean, I'm in south central Indiana. It is a very red state at the moment, and yet in the 2008 Obama election, it went for Obama. And the press was saying, oh, there's this spot where he's getting a lot of support. We think there's a university there. Compared to, of course, the boundaries of the university, and you go 4 miles in any direction, and the voting patterns are very different. So I think we have made whether we've done it, higher education has become a target politically. And that's because it's unaffordable, it's unavailable to a lot of people. They need it to earn higher salaries. The people who have it and do earn higher salaries are resented, and the outsiders are members of the same larger community, often, in which the university is nested. And the university, in our case, had to walk a fine line. It didn't initially participate in the first stage of our process, which was focus groups, even though they had been invited in by the mayor. And then when the commentary about, with a lot of resentment and bitterness, came out about the university not regulating its borders and the activity of students, and then people who are homeless being called racist epithets by students who were walking out of the bars. And there was this conflict at the boundaries where we engage. So I guess what I'm recommending is that yes, this is very helpful within the university in terms of a managerial framing. I would argue that it not be a top-down hierarchical managerial framing, but a flatter, more engaging framing. But we also need to engage across our boundaries, not simply within campus, but engaging across into the community, because that is a learning opportunity for the students on campus.
I appreciate Lisa's friendly amendment on outsiders. I would say I was certainly thinking about groups that are there to purely sabotage the process. And at the same time, I'd say we have, when I was in Department of Justice, we certainly worked with and talked with those groups too. These anarchist groups, in order to figure out ways of doing it. When I was interviewed for my position, the Associate Attorney General, Tom Pirelli, asked me, was I comfortable working with white supremacist groups? And that, that's part of the job, to deal with people whose viewpoint you might hate. So I appreciate your furthering that conversation.
Thank you again to the panel. We are at the end of this panel. If you can join me in thanking them.